This is a complete analysis of the U.S. electoral system and its failings. In my view, the failings baked into the structural roots of the U.S. electoral system are the biggest cause of political dysfunction and polarization in the United States. My goal? To show clearly the structure of America's elections and how those structures came about in the first place. This should show to you, the viewer, that America's issues are far deeper than whether the evil party or stupid party is in power. At the end, I offer my 2 cents and list a few structural solutions that could de-escalate things and make for a better electoral system in America if they were actually implemented. So where to start? For one, the United States electoral system, legally speaking, is far more similar to the electoral systems in North Korea or Turkmenistan than to those in Denmark or Belgium. That common thread shared between American and North Korean elections is first past the post. Also known as plurality voting, first past the post is a single winner, single choice voting system where the candidate that receives the highest number of votes wins the election. The declared winner does not need to win an outright majority of votes cast, merely the largest percentage share in comparison to each other listed candidate or choice. It also happens to be the type of electoral system that the United States predominantly uses across almost all of its legislative elections in single-member regional districts, as does North Korea and Turkmenistan, at least on paper. In comparison, Denmark and Belgium use slightly different flavors of proportional representation instead, where voters select a national party and that party gets approximately that percentage of seats in the parliament. Now, if you are from the UK or you have followed UK politics, you likely know exactly what I'm on about. But for many Americans, the phrase first past the post is likely unfamiliar. The reason being, speaking from personal experience as an American, the typical conversations about elections and voting in America are generally filled with nebulous, moralizing concepts about your civic duty to vote and the democratic will of the people and how every vote counts. And in my view, this framing is extremely dishonest, as the moralizing, thought-stopping cliches commonly spouted in response prevent a more proper conversation analyzing the electoral structure and voting systems on a technical level. But to understand why political polarization is so bad in the United States right now, we have to have this conversation. No moralizing, no tired cliches. Let's get cracking. Part 1. The core problem of first past the post. So why is first past the post a problem in America? In short, Duverger's law. In political science, Duverger's law, named after 20th century Marxist political theorist Maurice Duverger, holds that political systems with first past the post voting in single-member districts, like the United States, a two-party system is the structure that is favored to emerge organically with enough time. Sound familiar? It should, because even though there is no formal law in the books declaring only two parties can alternate back and forth in America's halls of power, that is sadly the reality on the ground for American politics. To put it more specifically, first past the post creates the following interconnected problems. 1. Lesser evil voting. To use the words of South Park, ever feel like voting is just choosing between a giant douche and a turd sandwich? That is exactly what lesser evil voting is. Instead of choosing the candidate you believe is the best, you end up choosing the least awful one so that the one you hate more doesn't win. To some, yours truly included, this essentially means being given the false illusion of choice. Smoke and mirrors for politicians to convince the voters that they do in fact have a say, when in reality, all these politicians are doing is distracting the voters with irrelevant drama, so that said politicians can continue to take advantage of the population and perpetuate a system that benefits only them, without the public ever catching on to what they are doing. Ever wonder why describing the American two-party political system as the uniparty became a thing? It's because of lesser evil voting, which only exists because first past the post systematically discourages voting for third-party candidates, which I will explain more in depth with the next point. Point 2. The spoiler effect. Under first past the post, the spoiler effect happens when a third-party candidate siphons off enough votes from one major party to cause the other major party to win the election instead. Case in point, the 2000 presidential election between George W. Bush and Al Gore. One of the most controversial presidential elections in all of American history. Despite Al Gore winning the popular vote by 500,000 votes, George W. Bush became president. Why? As with most insane clickbait to come from America, blame Florida. Because the U.S. uses an electoral college system to elect presidents via state delegation, presidential candidates need to win each state's plurality of votes to win all of that state's electoral votes. And without Florida, neither Bush nor Gore reached the magic number of 270 electoral votes to win. The problem? Florida was close, very close. In a state with nearly 6 million votes cast, Gore lost by only 537 votes, a margin smaller than 1,000th of 1% and well within any reasonable margin of error. Here is where the spoiler effect comes in. The largest third-party candidate, Ralph Nader, received nearly 100,000 votes in Florida. Given the Green Party's environmentalist policy agenda has more appeal on the left, Nader drew far more support from the sort of voters that would have otherwise voted for Gore, were Nader not on the ballot. This caused Gore to lose Florida, and ultimately cost him the national win against Bush by an electoral college margin of 271 for Bush, 268 for Gore, even though Gore had over 500,000 more votes overall than Bush. 3. Vote splitting. In elections where only a plurality of votes is needed to be declared the winner instead of an outright majority, a phenomenon known as vote splitting becomes possible. What does this mean? Say there is a hypothetical election in a two-party system where 60% of the voting base falls right of center, with the remaining 40% falling left of center. However, due to internal disputes on the right, two right-wing candidates emerge with large swaths of support, amounting to each candidate taking half of the right-wing voters. Meanwhile, the left only fields a single candidate. In a first-past-the-post electoral system, the left-wing candidate would actually be the one that was declared the winner of the election, because they had the largest vote share among individual candidates, 40%. What if I told you this was not a hypothetical scenario? It's exactly what happened in the 1912 presidential election. In that year's Republican primary, former President Theodore Roosevelt challenged his own successor and then President William Howard Taft for the Republican nomination over ideological differences on tariffs and labor rights. When Roosevelt narrowly lost the bid against his former Secretary of War, he launched a third-party presidential bid against the Republicans under his own newly created Progressive Party. The result? The former political allies turned foes effectively split the Republican vote. Together, their popular vote share was over 50%, with 27.4% going to Roosevelt and 23.2% to Taft. In comparison, the Democrats, fronted by Woodrow Wilson, and with only 41% of the popular vote, won the biggest landslide victory in the history of U.S. presidential elections, with 435 electoral votes to Roosevelt's 88. As for Taft, he got bupkis in the Electoral College, setting the stage for Wilson's enactment of an idealistic policy agenda that in hindsight was a massive failure, but that's another topic for another video. Part 2. The history with first-past-the-post voting and its emergence in America. First-past-the-post is by no means new. It has been in use in some form since the medieval era in Britain's House of Commons, and later spread elsewhere with the expansion of the British Empire. But with the Age of Enlightenment and the popularization of the belief in the right to self-determination, educated thinkers naturally discuss things such as how implementing more empirically accurate voting systems could lead to more democratic results. Consequently, many countries such as Denmark, Australia, New Zealand, and Belgium, former users of first-past-the-post opted to replace it with other voting forms that produce results far more representative of how the population actually voted. So what did America, the self-proclaimed beacon of democracy and shining city upon a hill, do? Well, first-past-the-post, of course. And the sad truth is, it didn't happen deliberately. America sleptwalked into it. And that's because when establishing the constitutional framework of the new United States, the Founding Fathers, seen as sages of great wisdom by many on the right, were, in my view, painfully naive and idealistic. They saw political parties as an institution to be viewed with suspicion and a threat to national unity. They envisioned temporary coalitions and shifting alliances between individual politicians, depending on the issue in question. To me, political parties are simply the natural vehicle that groups of people form to organize their collective interests within an electoral political system. So who was right, me or the founders? Sadly for history, I was correct, as nearly immediately after the basic constitutional framework of the United States was laid down, political parties as we know them immediately began forming. They were, Alexander Hamilton's Federalist Party, who favored a more centralized, unitary central government, and Thomas Jefferson's Democratic Republican Party, whom, despite the incredibly bureaucratic and convoluted-sounding party name, actually favored a more decentralized, confederated central government structure. As for the founders, when the constitutional framework of the U.S. government was first being drawn up, in the spirit of the Enlightenment, they left the matter of how to count votes and create congressional delegations to be something determined by individual states and, ultimately, the people. So much so that the phrase, powers not explicitly assigned to the federal government are to be reserved to the states and, ultimately, the people. And it was enshrined in the Bill of Rights shortly after the Constitution was made the law of the land. The formation of political parties not being foreseen wasn't even the biggest problem. The problem was that, having inherited the plurality vote counting structure from British law, said two parties had a very strong incentive to prevent a meaningful third party from forming. This was no coincidence. These incentive structures were unwittingly built into the constitutional framework itself, and no guardrails were put into place to prevent this kind of thing from happening. In short, the system created an incentive for political parties to do what many large megacorporations, supposedly in direct competition with each other, do. Collaborate with each other as a cartel to permanently shut out smaller players that could be a threat to their shared interest. So how did this system get so legally entrenched? First, we have to go back to the presidential election of 1800. The problem? Another one of America's less democratic, idiotic institutions, the Electoral College. Intentionally designed to give a higher proportional voting share to rural, less populated areas, it originally was even dumber than it is now, because originally, Electoral College votes didn't distinguish between votes cast for the president and the vice president. It simply was, most votes becomes the president, second most votes becomes the vice president. But in that year, it fell apart, as the Electoral College's result was tied between two candidates, Thomas Jefferson and Aaron Burr. The irony? On the Democratic-Republican Party ticket, Aaron Burr was Jefferson's running mate. Since members of the Electoral College were largely free to vote for who they wanted, and there were multiple rounds until a winner was declared, this essentially made it so the Federalists, who fielded Alexander Hamilton as their candidate but had lost, had gained the role of kingmaker. The losing party, the Federalists, would thus decide who became the U.S. president, leading to Jefferson eventually winning by convincing enough Federalist electors to swing for him. What the 1800 presidential election laid bare was that America's early electoral systems were a train wreck. And while the 12th Amendment was passed, stipulating votes for president and vice president were to be counted separately, it didn't change the fact that state governments, being the power-seeking political creatures they are, started using their political machinery to try and assure their interests were most represented in Congress by changing how the congressional delegations would be assigned vote share. This effectively shut out average citizens from having a direct vote in congressional representation. But the bigger problem, in the eyes of the politicians of the time, was that this situation also created a whole heap of recounts and legally disputed elections that were clogging up courts and hindering the ability of the government to function at all. So, in the typical fashion of American politics, aka decades of inaction before it even registers in the halls of power, the politicians came up with a solution, which, in typical form for politicians, was complete garbage. That solution was the Apportionment Act of 1842, which mandated congressmen can only be elected using single-member districts directly elected by the residents of that geographic district using plurality vote, better known as first past the post. Problem? Even though on the outside the stated goal was to create fair elections, in practice, mandating single-member congressional districts removed the last barrier that prevented the two existing parties of the time from institutionally shutting out any upstart political organizations, fulfilling all the conditions for the previously mentioned Duverger's law to take hold. Think the two parties alone having power in the U.S. are a coincidence? Think again. In the first few decades the U.S. existed as a country, political parties came and went over the years. The Democratic Republicans, the Federalists, and the Whigs as distinct political parties all emerged and later died out within that time. But since the Apportionment Act of 1842 was passed, only one new major political party would ever emerge, the Republican Party. The Democrat Party had already existed for 20 years by this point, but since the Republican Party's founding in the mid-1850s, barely 10 years after the Apportionment Act's passing, no new major party has emerged in America. This Apportionment Act, therefore, killed off the institutional dynamism that once existed and cemented the Democrat-Republican two-party dichotomy as a static, ever-ruling institution over America for the last 175 years. Part 3. Potential Solutions. The problems of a two-party system are clear, and to me, what's even clearer is that the public would be foolish to expect solutions to come from those within the system. After all, the politicians in office now are themselves the biggest beneficiaries of the two-party system being exactly the way it is. Asking them to fix it would be like asking them to kill their own golden goose, which nobody, especially self-interested politicians, would do if they wanted to keep their career. As a result, the following solutions are constitutional changes that likely would require a massive, unforeseen paradigm shift in the American political climate to happen. Ideally, they would all be implemented, but even in part, I believe the following structural changes would make a huge difference. Change 1. Abolish the Senate and implement a national American parliament with proportional representation. Much of the source of the lopsided political power dynamic in the United States comes from one place, the Senate. Why? Because whether or not you live in Wyoming or California, your state is assigned 2 senators. This means Wyoming's less than 600,000 people have vastly more per capita voting power in the Senate than do California's nearly 40 million, 68 times the voting power, in fact. And that carries over into the Electoral College's election of the president, too, but to a lesser ratio of 3.8 to 1. Now, nothing wrong with the people of Wyoming, but I am of the belief that one vote should count as, well, one vote. Persons shouldn't be able to get 68 times more voting power just for choosing to live in one place over another. Maybe for the Founding Fathers, especially the likes of Thomas Jefferson, a loose confederation of distinct states, more akin to the modern European Union, was ideal given the perceived vast cultural differences between each state. But functionally speaking, America exists as a single country. And while there are minor differences between the people depending on where you are, Americans have far more in common with each other than they do with anybody else on the planet. Speaking from my own personal experience, I have little in common with many of the people in Massachusetts, despite having grown up there. But I have found plenty of people from other parts of the U.S. I have quite a bit in common with. Yet, if I still lived there, the current system would deem my voice to be represented by the collective votes of the people of Massachusetts, which, given my earlier point, is 100% not the case and never will be. The question I ask is that in the age of the internet, why should all of my political representation stay artificially bundled with a bunch of strangers that also decide to live in the same geographic area? I say strangers because, let's be real, how often does anybody actually talk to their neighbors anymore? More than likely, your friends and family are in a few different places, some closer, some further away. There are diverse reasons people happen to live in close geographic proximity to each other, none of which guarantee having anything in common. And furthermore, for those that do feel an affinity to their geographic area and have things in common with those around them, doesn't the House of Representatives theoretically already offer a suitable political vehicle for advancing those shared, geographically relevant interests? All of this would be solved overnight by replacing the Senate with a national American parliament elected through party list proportional representation, such as how Sweden elects its unicameral parliament, the Riksdag. In Sweden's parliamentary elections, when a political party achieves a 4% national vote share or higher in parliamentary elections, that party is guaranteed seats in parliament roughly proportional to the national vote share won. To provide a concrete example, in Sweden's most recent parliamentary elections, the Christian Democratic Party won 5.34% of the total votes cast. As a result, of the 349 parliamentary seats total, the Christian Democrats were given 19 seats in Parliament, or 5.44% of the total. This is because in Sweden's Riksdag, not only are seats in parliament proportionally allocated to each party, there are also some specific seats in parliament allocated just to make sure each represented party's vote share more closely matches its voting share. The result is a true multi-party democracy where 8 parties simultaneously have seats in the parliament, and passing legislation requires ever-evolving coalitions and shifting alliances. Ironically, in this way, Sweden has exactly what the American founding fathers were hoping they could have for their newly founded nation. Contrast the Swedish example of the system making sure that each political party is allocated as close to the national popular vote share as possible with America, where places like Wyoming have 68 times more Senate voting power than California, or how Woodrow Wilson in 1912 won the presidency in the largest electoral landslide college in history with only 40% of the popular vote. Conveniently, this gets us to our next point. Change 2. Abolish the Electoral College. Easily the most popular and well-known of the proposed changes on this list, the Electoral College was designed for an idealistic political fantasy world that, even within the lifetime of the Founding Fathers, had already fallen apart. Through the Electoral College's emphasis on winning states and their entire delegations in full, instead of directly obtaining a majority, you can have scenarios where broadly less popular candidates ascend to elected office anyway, like was the case with Woodrow Wilson. This is because electoral votes are counted as follows. Each state gets electors equal to their number of representatives plus their 2 senators, plus an additional 3 for Washington, D.C., because the Senate is already heavily skewed towards overrepresenting smaller, less populated states, and the Electoral College factors senators into its calculation of assigning electors to each state. This Senate bias transitions into the Electoral College too. And in our Wyoming versus California comparison, where each Wyoming resident has 3.8 times the voting power in the Electoral College compared to a California resident, much better than the earlier 68 times voting power of a Wyoming resident in the Senate, but it's still completely out of whack and undemocratic. Given these facts, wouldn't it be logical to just, get rid of it? And the next question would be, what would replace it? Simple, a better, more fair voting system. Good example is how France and Finland elect their respective presidents. In these countries, if no candidate receives an outright majority, there is a second round of voting where voters pick between the top 2 candidates. Finland in particular is curious, as they previously used an electoral college, like the US did, but then got rid of it, which had the effect of reversing Finland's previous multi-decade-long cycle of democratic backsliding. And if running 2 rounds of voting is too tedious, another method that could work is national-level ranked choice voting for the presidential ticket. Also known as instant runoff voting, this system attempts to simulate 2 rounds of voting in one go, by instead allowing voters to numerically rank candidates from most preferred to least preferred. The candidate with the least first preference votes is eliminated, and the votes retallied for each voter's second preference. This continues in cascade until there are only 2 candidates, and the most votes at that final round is the winner. And it's not like ranked choice voting is some novel, untested system in America. Maine and Alaska both use it in their congressional and presidential elections. Hawaii uses it in their special elections. But even though these states have different voting systems than the norm, the only votes that actually matter in American presidential elections are those from the Electoral College. These state-specific systems are just different ways to assign electors. And to bring back the Wyoming-California example from earlier, no amount of individual states changing how they assign their electoral votes changes the facts that the votes are still tallied and filtered through the lens of a heavily skewed, electorally unequal by design Electoral College. And that's without getting into the faithless elector problem, which is a scenario where the electors in the Electoral College that are appointed by the states and are supposed to vote in line with their state simply decide, nah man, I'm good, and vote however they damn well please. Representing the people of the 4th largest country in the world, nah, I have a better idea. Let's take 538 people you've never heard of and give them the actual voting power. I'm 100% sure that's going to work out better. Not. The faithless elector problem isn't hypothetical. It's already happened. Multiple times throughout history, in fact, but most notably back in 2016 during the presidential election between Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton. In that year, 13 electors decided to basically ignore their state's voting results so they could stage a political protest against Trump. Most shocking is that there's no federal law that penalizes electors for disenfranchising entire states' worth of voters, and that 15 states specifically allow faithless electors to cast their ballot as they wish. No legal penalties, no voiding of ballots, and no replacing them in these 15 states if they don't comply. They're off the hook. Kind of hard to argue that the U.S. protects democratic values when there's this big gaping hole baked directly into its own constitutional framework. Conclusion. Political polarization in America isn't just some random tragedy. The incentives to make political polarization so bad in the United States were literally baked into its founding documents by the naivete of the founding fathers. With that naivete, America essentially sleepwalked into having a very undemocratic electoral system. Some of that is by design, yes, as the late 18th century was a very different time philosophically. Equality before the law, representation, and voting weren't exactly understood in the same way they are today. 3/5 compromise. What has become abundantly clear is that America's constitutional framework, one of the oldest continuous constitutional frameworks of any country in the world, is in some ways far past its sell-by date. Certain problematic 18th century notions still persist in the governmental structure of the country. And in my view, disentangling these toxic and archaic notions from the American system to stop their outdated notions from shaping the future of the United States is not just advised. It's necessary to diffuse the brewing civil unrest plaguing the country and preventing it from becoming something far worse. But what do you think can be done to solve this problem? Do you think that first past the post is the true root problem and everything else is the symptom? Or is it something else entirely? Let me know down in the comments below. If you like this video, consider hitting that like button or subscribing. Till next time, take care.